Hi, I'm Bianca Cotton, host of Behind the Confident Smile, and I am here with Marline Johnson today. We are going to be discussing her journey of surviving sexual violence. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Bianca. It's truly a pleasure.
Likewise. So, we are going to jump right in,
Okay.
going back, all the way back
Yeah.
to your earliest childhood memory. What is the earliest memory you have of childhood?
Of childhood?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. Like, I feel like some of those memories are kind of all jumbled together. And then some of them is like stories that have been told to you that you're like, do I remember? Or is this just because I've heard the story so many times? But I think for me, one of the earliest childhood memories that I have is we lived in a one-bedroom studio apartment, and sometimes there was upward of like 10 people living in that apartment.
Oh, wow.
But there was a porch, and my grandmother would take me on the porch and sit me and rock me as a little child. And so I think that's why I always loved being outdoors, because it was the place where, she used to soothe me.
That's a beautiful memory or a story that someone told you,
Yeah.
right? And as you continue the journey through childhood, what are some other memories that you have and that you hold?
A lot, honestly. I think some of the earliest memories I have are quite difficult, to be honest. I am a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, and that started at around age 3 or 4. And I have a very untraditional story in terms of having a mother who struggled with substance use and being, displaced and moved to Chicago. But in the earlier years of my life, I did have these experiences of sexual violence that were really riddled in secrecy and shame. Like, my perpetrator used his power and authority to really manipulate who I was as a little person, and guys did as a game, and guys did as, something that was secretive. And I think some of those root behaviors are things that I have been unlearning for the past 30 years.
Wow. So as a child, 3 or 4 years old, did you at that time have an understanding of what was happening, or did the understanding come later?
That's a great question. The understanding came later. I didn't know at the time what was happening was wrong. And as I mentioned earlier, from a very early age, you're told you need to listen to adults. You need to respect them. You need to trust them. And so I think my younger self was just trying to obey the things that I was told by my elders and by the people around me. And so it wasn't until I was older that I realized, oh, those things that were happening to me were not okay. And I also just didn't have the language to be able to articulate what was happening to me either. And it wasn't until I think it was in sex ed and having these conversations, and I'm like, oh, okay, there's stuff that we need to explore here, because, yeah.
Wow. So when that moment came in sex ed and you were like, this sounds familiar, what was your initial thoughts after realizing that I was a victim of sexual violence?
I think the initial thought is no, right? That isn't your actual truth, because you don't want to believe that someone would take advantage of your innocence, honestly, at that age, right? And co-opt it and corrupt it in a way that you really can't get back. And then you start to play back other instances of how that might have happened, or where you might have, also allowed other things to go by because of the way you've been conditioned. So I think there's a part of me that was like, this can't be my story. And then there was another part of me that was like, no, this actually is my story. And what do I do with it now, right? Do I tell someone because it happened so long ago? Do I not tell anyone and just, keep moving and pretending like it never happened? And I wrestled with that for some time before I finally came forward and told someone in my family.
Wow. How long did you wrestle with that? And what did that wrestling feel like for you?
I wrestled with it for at least over a year. I think I was maybe 16 when I finally told my grandmother what had happened to me, which I think lends itself to a whole other conversation around like how do you respond when someone shares something so deeply personal with you, and knowing how the first person you tell really dictates how you move after, in terms of like opening up and trusting people with that story. So yeah, I mean, I wrestled with it for quite some time, and
I'm sitting in the struggle of and the reality of realizing much later in your life, but still very young, right? 16, and you're in school. You're like, why am I just recognizing what happened?
Yeah.
Like, was there ever any conversations with any family members growing up like, this is positive touch, this is not so good touch?
Sure.
Like sometimes what we tell kids, if someone touched you in these parts,
Yeah.
tell somebody, or hugs are okay, or things of that nature. Were those conversations ever had with you or your siblings?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to be honest, I don't think so. And I dropped that in the context of there was a lot going on. As I
Right.
mentioned earlier, right? Like I'm the middle child of 5. I have 2 older brothers and 2 younger sisters. My mom struggled with substance use my whole entire life. We, were moving quite a bit, really trying to figure out our footing financially as a family. And sometimes when you have all of these external and interpersonal things happening, you miss some of those pretty crucial conversations. And so I don't recall having the conversation around safe or unsafe touch. And I, was reading this book called Deeply Formed Life, and it asks you to explore, right, your sexual formation. And as I just shared with you, my first encounter with my body in a way that was different than what I understood was sexual violence, right? And it was riddled in secrecy and shame. And so that is the foundation of my sexual formation as a person, is being secretive, it being something that you're not supposed to talk about, and you're supposed to hide it. And so I think about those things a lot, especially in later relationships, how that manifests itself. But I do think it's a crucial conversation that needs to be had with, little people at an early age around, what are the things that you should be looking out for, and how can you keep yourself safe?
Definitely. I'm curious, going back to your grandmother being the first person
Sure.
that you shared your story with. How did she respond to you?
Transparently, not in the way that I would hope. And I love my grandmother very deeply. She is someone who sacrificed a lot for me in my life for me to be able to get where I am. But I think she said something along the lines of like, well, he's dead now, so it doesn't matter. And it felt very dismissive in the moment of like me sharing something so intimate and something that I was holding. And so that's why I said, like, it really matters how people hold the space when folks share around their story. And granted, I had other outlets at that time in my life to be able to process through what I was dealing with, as I'm an artist, right? I'm a spoken word poet and a mosaic artist, and so I was using some of those other tools and mechanisms to process it. But if you don't have those tools, if you don't have those outlets, and you're really looking for it to be in someone else, and they don't respond in the way that you hope, that can be really difficult.
So what would you share with the loved ones who may be approached by another loved one, say, this is what happened to me? What advice would you give to them of how to hold and receive someone else's story about sexual violence?
Yeah, that's a great question too. I think the first thing I would say is just listen. Oftentimes, like when someone's sharing their story with you, they're not looking for you to fix it, which I think we all have this like fix it mentality of like, I just want to rectify the situation. And that's not usually what someone is listening to. For the first time in a long time, they don't want to feel alone in whatever they're carrying. And so just having someone to like listen and listen, you know, with their heart and with, you know, just to like really listen to them, I think is the most important thing. And then the second thing too is to just allow them to dictate what the steps are. Because again, I think people jump into fix it. I'm going to call this person. I'm going to confront this person. And sometimes those things can make it worse. So really allowing the survivor or the person who's sharing to really guide what the next steps are. And then also taking time, right? It's really hard to be on the receiving end of hearing something, hearing violence in general, or hearing something that's difficult. So take time after that conversation to really process what's coming up for you, if anything. Because I think sometimes it does, right? It triggers things in us that we didn't even know were there before. And so those are the first things that I would share with someone.
What's going on, Chicago? I'm Darius Caffey, and I invite you to join me for a new episode of The Table on Air with special guest, social media influencer, and powerhouse, DeAndre Brown.
For us, it's like, yeah, I'm delusional, but my delusions are gonna become my reality.
Join the conversation with us on Tuesday, October 24th at 7:30 p.m. on CanTV Cable Channel 19, streaming on cantv.org, and available on the CanTV Plus app. Experience the power of community television.
You mentioned you are a mosaic artist, spoken word artist, and just a creative in general.
Yeah.
Was that creativity born from a place of I need an outlet to cope with trauma, or do you feel like it was always in you?
I think it was both. My grandmother shares a lot that when I was a little girl, that I wouldn't talk a lot, but that I would draw pictures of things and people, and that was my way of just kind of like, I think, understanding and seeing the world. So I definitely think it is an innate kind of characteristic that, you know, God bestowed onto me, but it definitely was used as a tool. And I first started using it to process my mom's struggle with addiction, because that impacted our lives quite drastically. My grandmother was our primary caregiver. My mom was kind of in and out of our lives for the first maybe decade of my life. And so I was really trying to grapple with, you know, understanding how my mom would choose drugs over her children, right? And that was when I was younger. Right now, I have a much more broader context of like the battle that my mom was in, the battle for her life, honestly, right? Like when you understand addiction a little more intimately, you know that, you know, people are medicating themselves because they've been through something, and that is not the language, and that is not the understanding that I had when when I was younger. I just felt like I wasn't chosen.
Do you know your mother's story and like what led her to using drugs to cope with life?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think I know bits and pieces of it, but I don't know her full testimony. And that's actually something that I regret, because I think it would give me a lot more empathy for what my mom was navigating when we were coming up. Definitely. I asked thinking about like your grandmother's response and like just curious of the lineage and the things that we don't share. Absolutely.
Because maybe language was not there.
Yeah.
We just keep on keeping on.
Yeah.
In a sense. So with as you unpack, you're 16, talk to your grandmother, you're about to go off to college. How do you continue to heal in your college age years?
Yeah, so it isn't quite linear in the healing process. So I was in high school when I first shared the incidents that happened when I was a child, and then I get to college, and I think I understand the world, and then you realize that you don't understand the world at all. And then I am a senior in college, and I have another experience with sexual violence. Right, I was with a friend. We were traveling for spring break, and we were staying with a family friend of hers. And I fell asleep, and I woke up, and this person was on top of me. And and to your original question, I don't think I really started to unpack or really heal from those experiences, because, you know, I was like, oh, I did the thing. Like, I told someone, that's all I can do. But I do believe that my second experience with sexual violence when I was in college really opened me up to be a little bit more reflective and dig a little bit deeper into all the other things that I've experienced that I probably hadn't processed, because for a good chunk of that time I was really focused on, you know, how my mom's struggles impacted me, versus really diving into some of the other things that I was also struggling with.
Wow. How did that feel for the second instance to occur?
Yeah. So I definitely knew, right? You know, when I was a child, I was like, I didn't know and I didn't understand. And in that moment, I knew, and there's a pit in your stomach of like, there's the thought of like, I can't believe this is happening again, right? Like, and just understanding that those who experience violence, the statistics go up for them to experience violence again. And so really sitting and wrestling with that. And then this constant battle of understanding and trying to unpack that your body doesn't belong to you, right? In these moments, right? That someone feels like they have the agency and autonomy to claim your body as something that belongs to them. And I think that was something that I just really struggled with from that moment and after, because I was like, oh my gosh, this thing doesn't belong to me. And when something doesn't belong to you, you don't care for it well. So then that opened me up to a whole other myriad of just like how I engaged in sexual promiscuity, how I just didn't want to protect my body because I felt like I couldn't. And the second part, or where I start to really dive into the work of healing from sexual violence, is I went to grad school and I got a master's in art therapy, because I knew, as I mentioned very early on, that like art was something that helped me process some of like the biggest and hardest things in my life, and I wanted to understand, how do I learn to teach that to other people? And I remember sharing a piece of art. So I went to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and the interview process was insane. Yes. As you can imagine. And one of the things that they had us do was a group interview day, and they had you project a piece of your art on this very large screen, and talk about it in front of all of the other people who you are interviewing against, and the faculty and the staff of SAIC. And I remember sharing a drawing that I did in a art class that I took in college, and it was of my childhood best friend who had been a victim of gun violence in Chicago. And granted, she is still with us by truly by the grace of God. But I shared the impact of what it was like to leave someone, like to go off to college and leave someone behind as they're literally putting the pieces of their life back together. And I had one of the instructors come up to me afterwards, and they were like, hey, have you learned about this program? It was called A Long Walk Home. And they said, I think this would be a good place for you to like intern, and a really important community for you to be a part of. And A Long Walk Home is a nonprofit that's based here in Chicago, and they use art for interpersonal healing, but also art for social change with young people, with high school aged girls on the south and west side of Chicago. And so interning there, being around Black women who are leading that work, who are also therapists, I think really opened my eyes to just a different way of understanding what healing could look like. Which is a conversation we don't talk about a lot. We talk a lot about like what the trauma is, but we don't talk about like how do you heal from it. And so having that model really opened me up to, I think, begin to start the healing process for the first time.
I just want to clap. Yes. No, it's true, healing, and that's a big part of like why we're here, right? To talk about, okay, this is what happened, but this is how I healed, or it may still be healing.
Yeah.
To be quite frank. And curious if you could tap into one moment or one example of when I was creating this art or writing this piece, I felt healing, or I felt more freedom, more ownership of my body.
Yeah.
Again.
I think that was like what my whole master's thesis was about, was really exploring my two art forms, poetry and mosaics, as a way to support survivors, and really thinking about poetry as like the psychological vessel, right? The things that are in us, the thoughts that are in us that we're trying to process and work through, and mosaics as like the physical, the vessel, right? And there's something that's very tactile there. And thinking about how you expel trauma from the body. So having something that, you know, you're breaking glass, you're breaking tile, and that piece of work or that body of work was really grounded in the belief of like, you're able to create wholeness on a brokenness, right? Like you're able to be able to like pick up the pieces, the broken pieces, and reauthor your narrative and reauthor your story in the way that best fits you. Because I also think oftentimes like people place narratives and place stories onto you, and the enemy will try to do that too. They will try to place, you know, stories onto you, and they're not yours, right? And so in that process of breaking tile and picking pieces, it was like me metaphorically picking the pieces of my life up and putting them back together in a way that best fit me.
That's beautiful. I need to see a piece of this art.
I think the other part to that was like I started to really explore the female body and the female form. And so I think when people think of mosaics, they think of things that are flat, you know, on walls, and that's not the path that I took at all. All of mine are like three-dimensional sculptural pieces.
Oh. So you have a gallery at home.
I do have a body of work.
Okay. What do you do with your art after you create it?
Yeah. Sometimes I sell it. There's a couple pieces that I won't sell just because of the sentimental value of them and the space that I was in when I created them. And then sometimes I partner, like right now I'm in conversations with a gallery in Philly to have some of those pieces be shipped out there and a part of their collection. And so, yeah. And then some of them, you know, they just, you know, recycled and are used for other art pieces too.
Yeah. What would you want the little girl you to know about you now?
I think I would want her to know that you're gonna be okay, right? I think that there was so much that was happening at a young age that I was trying to like grapple and process through, and you just don't know what the other side looks like. And I think that I would also tell her that everything has purpose, right? Every single thing that you went through has a purpose, and you might not understand it now, but God, you know, used those trials, used those tribulations, and is forming you and is forging you to be able to help other people, you know, at a later moment. And so I think I would just tell her to be patient.
Oh, patience is hard, ain't it? when you're in the fire.
Yeah.
And is there any last thought you want to share with anybody at any age that may have just recently experienced sexual violence and may fear saying what happened to them?
Yeah. I think the first thing I would say is like, you are so much more than the worst thing that's ever happened to you, right? Because I think sometimes we get stuck in those places. And I would also tell them that it is a journey. Like, it is something that you will be processing and walking through for the rest of your life, but you're not alone in it. One, just because statistically, right, like, we know that these things are happening. We know that 1 in 4 women will experience sexual violence before the age of 18. So you are not, so you walk into a room and you know, right, automatically, if there are 4 women, one of them probably has experienced violence. And so I think I would want them to know that they are not alone, that there are a community of people out there that want to support them and walk with them and help them on their path of just understanding themselves, understanding the world, and understanding their healing.
Thank you. Thank you for opening up a couple of pages of your book and sharing from a heart-centered place on such a challenging topic to share, but you are more than your story.
Yeah.
And you know that you have owned that. And to be here today is a true blessing to talk to you.
Thank you. Yeah. As I mentioned, it is always such a gift to be able to share space with you. And I believe that these conversations are a part of my purpose and my calling, to be able to have them, to be able to share some of the most intimate parts of my lives, and with the hope that someone else's breakthrough is on the other side. And so sharing, opening myself up to conversations with folks who want to have them, need to have them, don't know how to have them, because it's so necessary. And, you know, healing happens in community, and it's something that we can't do alone. So
Definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all for tuning in today. Take care.